So Izzy and his partner were proud co-owners of the local dry cleaners establishment. And one day at dinner time, Izzy's 9-year-old son said to him, "Dad, what's ethics?" And Izzy said, "Ethics? Yeah, we were talking about that in school, but I don't understand. What's ethics?" So Izzy thought about it for a minute, and he goes, "Okay, here you go. Suppose somebody comes into my dry cleaners, and they bring in their suit for me to clean." Kid says, "Yeah." And the dad goes on and he says, "Suppose when I'm cleaning that, I find a $100 bill in the pocket of the suit." And the kid leans in close because he knows he's about to find out what ethics is. And he says, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, son, at that moment, I have to ask myself a very important ethical question. Do I share the money with my partner?" We're in the 5th week of Toy Box Leadership. Christian leadership as seen through the lens of toys that we played with as kids. First week was the Slinky Dog. We talked about vision. The second week was Little Green Army Men. We talked about strategy. The third week was Legos, and we talked about relationships. Last week it was Mr. Potato Head, and we talked about communication. And today it's the Rubiks Cube. The Rubiks Cube, and we're going to talk about ethics. So like the kid in the joke, I'm going to say, what is ethics? Well, dictionary.com says ethics is a system of moral principles or rules of conduct that are recognized in respect to human action. Let me say that again. A system of moral principles or rules of conduct that are recognized in respect to human action. So ethics is a moral framework within which we choose, and that's the key word here, choose to live our lives. The 1980s. I don't know about you, but I was finishing up college at the beginning of the 1980s, and I was married and had a kid by the end of the 1980s, so it's a pretty big decade for me. But it was the decade of parachute pants and members-only jackets and big hair. Even I had big hair in the 80s. And skinny ties and Ronald Reagan and Madonna and Cabbage Patch Kids and Trivial Pursuit. But nothing defines the decade of the 80s quite like the Rubik's Cube. It's colorful, it's complex, it's trendy, and it's proving to be timeless. It was invented in 1974 by a 29-year-old Hungarian architecture teacher named Erno Rubik. And he was from the Soviet Union, and it took 6 years for the marketing to get out of the Soviet Union. And wasn't much marketing going on in the Soviet Union. So for the first 6 years of this thing's existence, it didn't do much. But then it made it out of the communist bloc countries and made it out into the rest of the world. And in 1982, they sold 100 million of these things in that year alone. And Professor Rubik became the first self-made millionaire out of the communist bloc. In fact, I read an interesting thing. Some historians believe that it was the Rubik's Cube, the capitalistic success of the Rubik's Cube, that began the end of the Soviet Union. So there are historians that believe this little guy brought the Soviet Union down. I don't know about that myself. Over the past 25 years, 250 million of these things have been sold, making it one of the best-selling toys of all time. I was reading about solving it, and I got to be honest. I've seen those guys on TV, and they solve it. And I thought, well, surely there's a video for that. And there is. If you YouTube it, you can find videos. And I thought, okay, I'll watch the video. Maybe I can figure that out. I got about 8 seconds into the video and went, that's not going to happen. So I left that alone. But the world record for solving a Rubik's Cube is 10.48 seconds. Other Rubik's Cube records include the fastest solving it one-handed, which was 20.09 seconds. The fastest solving it blindfolded, I don't know how you do that, but 23.06 seconds. And the fastest solving it by only using your feet, 78 seconds. And then the last one was the number of Rubik's Cubes solved in a 24-hour period, 3,390 of them. I don't know who has that kind of time, but that's what they did. So Rubik's Cube and ethics. Making the right turns. So what does the Bible have to say about that? What does the Bible have to say about ethics and about making the right turns? As always, it has a ton to say, but I picked what I think is maybe the definitive understanding of ethics as found in the Bible. It's found in a couple different places, but I chose the one from Exodus chapter 20. Hear these words, very familiar words. God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself idols. You shall not bow down and worship them. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, or wife, or manservant, or anything that belongs to them. So the Sunday school teacher was talking with her 5- and 6-year-old Sunday school class about the 10 Commandments. And she had just gotten done explaining the whole honor your father and your mother piece. Because let's be honest, if we're parents, that's the one we lift up the most at home, isn't it? Amen. So she had just gotten done explaining that, and she says, now, boys and girls, is there a commandment that teaches us how to treat our brothers and our sisters? Now, without hesitation, a little boy raised his hand and said, thou shalt not kill. Would you believe that 97% of Americans say that the 10 Commandments are important, but only 5% of Americans can actually name more than 3 of them? That's a frightening statistic to me. Valerie, I'm with you. That struck me. I wanted to take a survey of my own after I heard that, but that's what I read this week. 97% of people believe they're important. 5% can say more than 3 of them. So let's review them. No other gods. No idols. Don't take God's name in vain. Keep the Sabbath holy. Honor your father and your mother. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't lie. I counted wrong, but don't want what others want. There we go. So why have 10 commandments? Why do we need 10 commandments? Look at it this way. If you play a sport, there are rules. And without rules, it's anarchy when you play a sport. Games without rules are unthinkable. Try driving without traffic rules. I've seen people do that, I think, but as a matter of fact, I live just right next to the high school. I saw some people doing it last night trying to park by the high school, but try driving without traffic rules. Submit to surgery from a physician who hasn't gotten his medical license. Rules are important. But the 10 Commandments aren't a rule book. I want to say that right up front. They're a relational contract. And they are committed to Christian love. They're not just about doing the right thing. And they're about how we act in relationship with God and how we act in relationship with each other. The 10 Commandments are a blueprint for fulfilling our Christian life. They're moral principles that offer our best hope for the future. Universal biblical truths that don't have an expiration date stamped on the bottom. So the Rubiks Cube and ethics. I don't know about you, but I can remember in high school, people figured out that I'm not going to do it, but if you twisted it just right, you could pop it apart. And you could start popping pieces out. And I remember watching a guy, he popped it completely apart and then reassembled it so that it dropped on the floor. He reassembled it so that it looked like this. That's how he solved it, was he broke it apart and stuck it back together. I remember, I don't know if you can still do that or not, but I remember they used to be able to peel the little stickers off. And I saw another guy peel them all off and reassemble them so that it looked like this. No matter how he did it, he cheated. But to solve it correctly, it takes work. And it takes ethics to solve it correctly. And there are ethical parallels to how we look at what the Bible has to say about us and about how we live our lives. And here they are. The first one, there is an acceptable standard of what's right. There is an acceptable standard of what's right. Just like the fact that the Rubik's Cube isn't solved until all 6 sides are solid color, acceptable standards of what's right in the world are obvious rules and expectations that form our understanding of those standards. What's obviously right and wrong is easy to see in other people. Right? What's obviously right and wrong is easy to see in other people. It's a bit more obscure when we apply it to our own lives. But obscurity doesn't change those ethical principles. When the Queen Mary was converted into a hotel out in Long Beach, California, it was docked out there, they took the 3 giant smokestacks off of it with the intention of refinishing and repainting them. And as soon as they took them off, they crumbled into dust. Because over the years, the metal had corroded, and it was only the many coats of paint that held it together until they took it off, and then it just crumbled to dust. Looked great on the outside, but it had no substance and depth on the inside. See, when we do things correctly, we help create order around us. And when we do things incorrectly, we help create chaos. Policies may change, but right and wrong don't change. So we need to offer a sense of what's right through the example that we set. The rules we choose to live by. The ones that we choose to ignore. That's what establishes our character. Not only the ones we pick to live by, but maybe more importantly, the ones we choose to ignore. It's one thing to be at a loss for words, but it's an entirely different thing to be at a loss for values. So the first parallel to the Rubik's Cube is that there is an acceptable standard of right. The second one is that there are no shortcuts in ethics. In one of the earliest ads for this thing, when it first hit the market, they boasted that there are 43 quintillion possible moves, but only one solution. What's cool is that despite that staggeringly high number, any Rubik's Cube, and trust me, I can't do it, but any Rubik's Cube, if you know what you're doing, can be solved in a maximum of 27 moves. Even though there are 43 quintillion possible moves, if you know what you're doing, you don't need more than 27 moves to solve this thing, if you know the right moves to make. Because there are no shortcuts. There are only right or wrong moves to make.